Well, hello and welcome back to another VA2A News video today, guys. We got a lot of fun stuff chit-chatting. I'm Rob, I'm your host. If you liked anything that you see today, don't forget to check the links down below. I've got all of that paid out down there for you, so it's just laid out nice and fine. If you like what we're doing here, go ahead and support us by clicking on any of the Amazon links. I've got some shirts down there, VA2A kind of style, patriotic shirts. I've got some coffee linked, as well as just something else. I forget what's down there. But anything you purchase through those links, send a couple pennies my way. I'd greatly appreciate it. What a crazy thing, man. What a crazy weekend. Riots going on all over the place. People getting shot up in Wisconsin. But today we're actually going to bring it back a little bit closer to home. Today we're going to be talking about a local gun ban that Norfolk is considering ever since they got their ability from the Virginia General Assembly to preempt state law. So we're going to talk about that, and that's coming up right now. Lots of fun stuff. So let's jump into it. We're actually going to answer another question. I think let's actually kind of lay this out a little bit differently. We're going to look at the no local gun control movement that's going on in Virginia. We've talked about that a little bit in the past. We're also going to look at the constitutional powers of the sheriff. We're going to talk a little bit about what defunding the police actually means and how that would restore the power of the sheriff to the people, which would then make overreaching laws by the General Assembly moot in many ways. Now, if all of this sounds like it's too good to be true, right, it may very well be. So this is a 30,000-foot overview of these types of things, but I am going to be supporting what I'm talking about with the sections of law in with the Virginia Code. Another thing that I think is interesting here is that we haven't really heard much about this particular, I guess, conversation. It's not out there. Like, why aren't more sheriffs talking about this? We've got a few that do talk about it, and we're going to get to them in just a moment. Let's start off with this. Since this is all about the sheriff, I'm bringing over here. So let me move this little thing. I want you to hear something and why sheriffs are so important. And if you've ever asked yourself, how can the sheriff stand up to the governor? How can the sheriff say, no, I won't do something that the governor or the General Assembly wants them to do? Well, that's because the sheriff is a constitutionally elected officer, right? It's very important. So when these sheriffs are talking about this right now, they're talking about defending you, the people, from overreaching governments. Have a listen.
As the elected sheriffs in your community, we support your Second Amendment rights to bear arms.
We took an oath to uphold both the constitutions of the United States and Virginia.
Contact the governor and your legislators and ask them to support the Second Amendment.
As your sheriffs, there is nothing more important to us than the safety and security of you and your families.
Authorized and paid for by the Virginia Citizens Defense League.
Now, that's important to see right there. If you don't know that the VCDL is fighting for us all the time here in Virginia, well, you're just out of the loop. They are. The VCDL and the GOA, but really the VCDL is hooking it up here. There's lots of groups, lots of people, the executive members, Philip Van Cleve, Brenda Mooney, those guys. I can't even think of any other. Those are the ones I have most experience with. And I don't know them personally. I know Brendan casually, and I don't know Phil anything other than just seeing him like you might see him somewhere. But I can tell you right now that I believe that they are doing one amazing job, and I want to continue my support for them, which is why I'm a member. I hope that you are. I don't get anything from being a member, but if you want to preserve your Second Amendment rights in Virginia, the VCDL is fighting for it for you. So the answer to that question right there was actually kind of posing another thought or statement, and that is that what is the sheriff? How are they standing up, and what do they do? Well, the thing that brought this about is, have you ever wondered why the police do what they do? Like, why the cops have to stand there? Like for the McCloskeys, you know, lots of the cops came out and said that when they went there and had to gain their rifles, take their firearms from them after all that stuff that happened in Missouri, they felt bad about it. Well, we're going to explain that. The cops are compelled. They must do what they are told to do. The sheriff is not. And we're going to get into the law about that in just a minute. I'm going to show you where in the law gives the sheriff the right to say no and do what they want, and where in the law it says that the police officers must do what they're told. I'm also going to tell you about what it would look like if the police were defunded in Virginia. That might scare some of you. You might have just turned off right now. What are you talking about, Rob? That sounds crazy. Well, if you stick around, you might realize that defunding the police would not create a vacuum. We have a constitutional authority that steps in that has been usurped by the police departments. You don't know this because they don't teach it so much in civics class or Virginia law or anything like that. But the reality is the chiefs of police, the police departments, usurp the authority, the constitutional authority of the sheriff. And the sheriff is beholden directly to the people the police chief and the police are beholden directly to a government official. It even speaks about that in the law. So if you want to know why the cops have to do what they're told, it's because the charter of accreditation requires that they follow all orders, lawful orders. The sheriff, however, has authority to not do that. It's one of the checks of power provided by the Constitution, the Virginia Constitution. Now, we're going to be speaking specifically about Virginia today, but you're also going to notice that a lot of this stuff is going to mimic in other counties across America. So you can find the same kind of information. If that sounds interesting to you, if you're wondering about any of that right now, well, go ahead and check it out. So what brought this question up, I've been thinking about this for a few days, and today I just couldn't hold my mouth anymore. I had to kind of bring this idea and get this idea out into the ether because I haven't heard it floating around anywhere. But Norfolk considering a ban on guns in the city parks and buildings. Of course, my my inbox was lit up with this when it came out just over Friday, I believe it was, and stuff like that. Just suffice it to say that the no local gun control movement, much like the constitutional sanctuary city movement that the VCDL manifested last November, has really taken off once again. And the idea is that the localities, the towns and the cities, received authority from the Virginia General Assembly. And I forget the bill, so those of you that know the bill, say it right down there, but I just don't have it in my notes right now. I'm sure it's over on the VCDL page, but please forgive me not knowing the bill right now. But they were granted the ability to create local gun control legislation for city property. Well, if you think about city property and city buildings and things like that, it's all city property unless it's private property. So that effectively comes back to, and that effectively reverses the preemption, which would not have allowed cities and local localities to create laws that were more strict than the state law. Well, that kind of reversed that whole deal. So now it makes it difficult to go from place to place and know the laws. And in Norfolk, if you break it, it's a $2,500 fine and a year in jail. Recognize jail is not prison. One's sheriff, one's state, or one's federal. So there are some differences there. So after seeing this headline and realizing that I've been out to Norfolk, I've been with the VCDL, I've reported in Norfolk for you guys, and seeing the lackluster response from most of the citizens, I'm sorry to say, Norfolk, we as a people, we as a community, if you're out there, Chesapeake, wherever you are, we've got to get out there to Norfolk, guys. We have to get out there to Norfolk and get our voices heard. Whether or not it'll do anything right away, it might not. And that's where my conversation today comes in. The conversation about the sheriffs is really where we can make a stand that it doesn't seem that there is any push being made against them. There's also even a very interesting rally call by the left right now called Defund the Police. And we can take up that rally call of defunding the police, which they don't recognize, does not create a vacuum and reallocate assets and things like that to other areas, but then just reinstates the constitutional authority of the sheriff. Wow. And it still does accomplish a couple of things, like put community policing and budgeting in the hands of the representatives, such as the people. That's pretty cool. It really restores the balance of power. Now, what that would look like and how that sounds may be kind of strange, but the reality is it's already set up in our system of government. So with all of that out of the way, let me tell you what, Ludland County, this was a month ago, July 11th, but Ludland County plans to ask voters about forming a new police department. I believe this is a terrible thing. And the reason that it's a terrible thing is because it takes the authority of the sheriff, which is directly beholden to the people. The sheriff is directly responsible to the people. The deputies are directly responsible to the people. And it creates a police force. Now, this article talks about the police force not going live until the end of the sheriff's term in 2024, which is fine. But at that point in time, a police force is formed. And then the police are not directly beholden to the people. The police are directly beholden to the government officials. It even says it in the law that we're going to look at here. You see all these little tabs. I'm going to show you there. So here's an example of right now where a county, because we think that policing is something that cops are great. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for policing. I'm all for cops. I think that if we were to move to a sheriff-based policing, then most of the cops would just transition over into the policing. But what it does, the difference between the sheriff and the police, the biggest thing that does is it puts the control of those people into the different hands of the people. So with a sheriff, the control and the responsibility is to the people. the people being the members of the locality, the voters. But with the police force, the police chief and the police that are appointed, they are not beholden to the people. They are therefore beholden to the police chief. The police chief is beholden to the city council or the city mayor or whatever entity in one of the several forms of government that Virginia allows. By doing that, you now have something that people must follow, the police must do, rather than a situation where a sheriff can decide what the deputies do. And that's going to make a lot of sense here in just a minute. If I didn't make it very clear, let's just hear what Mr. Jenkins, Scott Jenkins, he was one of the foremost sheriffs that came out about enforcing laws and stuff like that late last year, and said that no, he wasn't going to put up with the, I'm paraphrasing a lot right here, I don't have it pulled up, but he was against quite a bit of the gun control and said that he would not allow that to happen in his county. He directly bucked the governor. How can you do that? Well, he's got a real good explanation. Who does the sheriff work for? You see, many people are just used to thinking because we've lived such a simple life, an easy life, we've made it simple since these past couple of wars and all that other stuff. We've gotten comfortable in our ideology and our ways of life. We just kind of think that, you know, the president tells the states what to do and the states tell the cities what to do and the cities tell the counties what to do. It doesn't work that way. That's why Ilhan Omar and that's why AOC and whoever can say whatever they want about the president and he can't fire them. It's because they're duly elected. They have power. That's real power. Power from the people. The sheriff does too. In fact, the sheriff is the lowest form of government where the people have the most power. It's one of the 5 constitutional officers that are elected before a mayor, and the sheriff has the power to enforce the laws that the sheriff believes or doesn't believe. So a Virginia sheriff is one of the 5 constitutional officers of the Commonwealth. This means that under the Constitution of Virginia, voters elect a sheriff. As an elected official, a sheriff answers to the citizenry and cannot be controlled by a government official. A sheriff is one of the few law enforcement officers who are responsible to all people in the community and not just a select few. Contrast that to the chief of police, who is typically hired and appointed by a governmental body and ultimately answers to his or her government employees. This could be a mayor, a city manager, a town council, or other governing body. Thus, a chief of police is a government employee, whereas a sheriff works for the people. The sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer of the county he or she serves. Now, if your mind isn't blown right now and that didn't start turning some wheels, go ahead, take a sip of coffee and knock that dust off a little bit. I'm going to grab a sip, just take a real quick break. Hold on one second. Yeah, talking about this stuff really gets your mind going, doesn't it? So we're talking about why the sheriff is the lead chief law enforcement officer of the county, and the fact that the sheriff is responsible to the people. As a constitutional officer, you can't fire the sheriff. The sheriff can do what he or she wants. Police chief, police officers, on the other hand, are beholden to a government employee. They're beholden to town board or something, and they can be hired and fired and have all of the politicking that jumps in when you start putting that stuff together. So let's look and see where we actually find it in the code. A lot of this comes down to counties, cities, and towns and how Virginia is formed. I'm going to brush through this. Remember, this is a 30,000 foot overview. But if you think about it, in order to have an entity which is recognized by the General Assembly and then accredited to be a locality, right? You have to have some things that happen first. And first, you have to have a definite location and space, right? Now, this happened way back when. Doesn't matter how the land got there. Doesn't matter whatever. But when Virginia became Virginia, well, that area was the land owned by Virginia. Certain areas formed entities, such as counties and towns, by coming together, establishing a group of people that elected several officials, which then were able to request a treaty and accreditation with the Commonwealth and be granted recognition, thereby giving it a name. Well, this happened for all the land in Virginia, and you can imagine that happened hundreds of years ago. So there's not really any unincorporated land in Virginia that's not owned anymore. The term unincorporated is an important term here because that's what happens that takes a county and changes its form of government to a city or a town. generally, and there are some exceptions. So as a period of time, we continue going along, and next thing you know, sheriffs are working fine for us. But as land begins being developed, more and more areas need to be created in order to generate revenue and taxes and be built up, and these things become cities and towns. Well, people at that point in time vote on a referendum to create a city or a town. That city or town is then approaches the General Assembly with a particular number of board members. These board members are elected officials, and those elected officials are Commissioner of the Revenue, a Commonwealth Attorney, a sheriff, a clerk, and there's one more I can't remember. I'm sure it's right over here. We'll find it in a second. But there's 5 positions, okay? None of those those positions come together as a representative body and ask for accreditation. They are then granted a crest of some sort, the obverse or reverse crest, once all of these things are met, and they are then Norfolk or Virginia Beach or whatever. Now, this is a very quick overview, so you can go and there's a couple of local books that are really great about how Virginia Beach became Virginia Beach, specifically how South Norfolk is actually in Chesapeake. And it's through this period of the late 60s of incorporation in different areas and such like that. But when that happens, that creates a different kind of law on top of the county, and in many ways diminishes and completely derides the county. Well, that law itself there then allows for additional ordinances. One of them being a referendum to elect or establish a police department, and a referendum to abolish a police department. You cannot abolish the constitutional position of sheriff. So within a county, the sheriff maintains their authority as the chief law enforcement officer. We're going to jump across these. So let's look at the powers and the duties of the sheriff prior to incorporation or establishing a police department, because it changes. The police department fundamentally changes how a sheriff operates. And this is important. Remember, the narrative that I'm sharing with you here is that the silly concept of defunding the police, abolishing the police, doesn't actually get rid of that power vacuum, right? It doesn't actually get rid of this leftist idea. In fact, what it does is it restores the power of the people to the office of the sheriff, because the sheriff is directly beholden to the people, receives their power from the people, receives the ability to adjudicate laws from the people or execute laws from the people. A sheriff and his deputies also have the power to choose which laws not to follow. It's a check on the form of government. It's a check and balance. So if you have an overreaching city council or an overreaching legislature that creates a law that is just stupid, a police officer is required to follow that law. We'll see that in a second. It's in the code. It's in their authorities. They must enact that law. They must they must execute that law. A sheriff can say, "Nah, it doesn't make any sense." That's why earlier in the broadcast, when we showed those sheriffs standing up and saying they're going to protect your constitutional rights, they can. Sheriff Jenkins did, because they can choose which laws and which laws are not enforceable in their counties. So anyways, the power of the sheriff. So that's what we're talking about right here. The power of the sheriff. The sheriff shall exercise the powers conferred and perform the duties imposed upon sheriffs by general law. He shall have custody of and be charged with the duty of feeding and caring for all prisoners confined in the county jail, and he shall perform such duties and the board imposes upon him. This is extremely broad because the power of the sheriff is that wide. Think about that. Many things fall into that. It says nothing in here about the sheriff must execute the laws enacted by the General Assembly or the ordinances or the state and local laws. It says that the sheriff can do what the sheriff does as having the power of the sheriff conferred upon him by the people, by being duly elected. That's exceptionally important to this. Moving forward, we're going to find in Chapter 17, this is 15.2 of the Virginia Code, Counties, Cities, and Towns, Subtitle 2, Powers of Local Government, Chapter 17, the power of the public police and order. Chapter 16 was about the sheriff, by the way. The powers of the police officer, right? Police and public order, right? So what are they? Well, first of all, police officers are preservation officers of the peace and good order. And it says any locality can provide for the protection of its inhabitants and property for the preservation of peace and the good order therein. That sounds normal. That's what the sheriff does as well. That explains why the sheriff is there. Here's the most important part the very next part of that is the organization of police forces. When a locality provides for a police department, the chief of police shall be the chief law enforcement officer of that locality. And it goes on to say that, however, in a town, you could call that the town sergeant. So they have different names. A locality may, by ordinance, provide that the organization of authorized police forces, such as forces, shall include a chief of police and such officers as are appropriate. And when a locality provides for a police department, the chief of police shall be the chief law enforcement officer. Earlier in the broadcast, when we were talking, I said that the establishment of a chief of police, an establishment of a police force, usurps the constitutional authority of the sheriff in the area, in the town, in the incorporated location which they are in. This is where we get it from. 15.2-1701. The police department itself usurps the power because the police department then becomes the chief law enforcement officer of that locality. Well, if you want to know why the Virginia Beach sheriff can't step up and say, like, hey, we're not going to follow this gun law. There will be no local gun law. We will not enforce those laws. It's because the police department has already usurped the law enforcement responsibility from the sheriff by its founding. The sheriff does not have control of that anymore. We recognized that earlier when we were talking right here, powers and duties of the sheriff. The sheriff shall exercise all powers conferred upon him and the duties imposed upon the sheriffs by general law, and he has the custody of being charged with all of those things for the prisoners and anybody confined in jail, and he shall perform such duties as the board imposes upon him, except when the locality provides for a police department and when a locality's police department, within that police locality, the chief of the police shall be the chief law enforcement officer. 15.2-1702, the referendum required prior to the establishment of a police force. We recognize that as the sheriff being one of the 5 locally required constitutional officers, establishing a police force, that this police force, if they were to usurp that authority, they would have to have some kind of referendum or law in order for that to happen. This is how the police department is established. It's 15.2-1702. This is Virginia Code, and here it is. The governing body of any county shall petition by the court by resolution asking that a referendum be held on the question, shall a police force be established in the county, and shall the sheriff's office be relieved of the primary law enforcement responsibilities? Well, there you go. When that happens, the police department is established. Obviously, it takes some build-out time. And the power of the sheriff to choose which laws or to duly enact policing in that area is gone. If that sounds like a lot of fun for you, here's another one. There's a referendum, 15.2-1703, a referendum to abolish the police force. If you wish to go back and reestablish the sheriff as the high constable of the land, then this is how you do it. Now, in areas that don't have a police force already established, such as Loudoun County, like we were talking about earlier, right here, they don't currently have a police force established. Well, why would you want to establish that police force? To whose benefit is that police force being established? If you think about the job of policing in Loudoun County, well, the sheriff's already doing the job and his deputies are already policing. Reading this article, the Board of Supervisors chair, Phyllis Randall, gives a reason for why. Well, we've got a good sheriff now, but what if we get a bad sheriff? And here's what she talks about. She wants a police force because she wants consistency. No, she doesn't want consistency. What she wants is a police force that is beholden to the mayor, that has to do what the mayor's told. Thinking here, like her concept here, that what if we get a bad one? We've got a great sheriff now, but what if we get one that we don't like? That completely undermines the concept that the voters, the people, know what they want and would vote for the type of policing that they want. Well, this sounds a lot like local policing, one of the tenets of defunding the police. So here we have an immediate cognitive dissonance. We have some discord between this. One of the concepts of the far left for this defund the police movement is that you'd have budgets kept in check because you'd be able to, you'd be able to reallocate the money from the police force to areas for community policing, and the policing would be representative of the people there. Well, right now, the police force doesn't do any of that. Sure, you got affirmative action and some other things, but the police force, none of the police officers nor the police of the chief are beholden to the people. They're all employees. And as such, those employees can be hired and fired by the police force, not voted in and voted out by the citizenry. So defunding the police, the tenets of it is actually already in the Virginia Constitution with the sheriff, because you would have 100% community-based policing, because the sheriff and the deputies would be beholden to the people. The sheriff has the right to terminate a deputy, decertify a deputy at any point in time without any question. Not so when you're an employee of the state, right? But when you're a constitutionally elected officer, given the ability to vest into a deputy and deputize someone with a constitutional delegation of authority, you can take that delegation of authority away, and it can't very easily be checked. You can check a cop's authority and a police officer's authority by firing the chief of police, by this and that and the other. So the police work in the benefit of the county, of the city or the town, but the sheriff works in the benefit of the people. Why on earth would London, Virginia, want to get rid of their beautiful sheriff style, right? Because it takes away the accountability from the sheriff to the people, is what I'm saying. It also takes away the sheriff's choice in what laws to enforce or not enforce in the county, should laws be repugnant to him, such as the Culpeper sheriff that we saw earlier. Moving on along. Okay, we've talked about that. I think we're on our last tab. The powers and duties of a police force. This is 1704, 15.2-1704. This is kind of putting a bow on it to show you how the police officers operate. This is very important. Remember, a sheriff is a constitutionally elected officer. A deputy is a sworn officer who has had the sheriff delegate some amount of authority, and the sheriff, through the process of deputization, is guaranteeing that the deputy is in good order. There are qualifications. And you can't just fire a deputy. The sheriff has to dismiss a deputy. And I'm sure you could say there's all this hiring and firing law and all these other things. Not exactly. Now, this conversation isn't about the law of employment law, but there is a difference between a police officer who takes an oath and is hired as a police officer for a police force, and a deputy who is also hired but swears an oath and is deputized. The act of deputization, police officers are not deputized, except in counties where the sheriff may deputize them. Police officers are not deputized. They're certified. There's a difference. That deputization grants power. Now, that doesn't mean that the sheriffs and the deputies couldn't abuse power. LA County is going through a lot of that right now. In California, they've been going through it for a long time. But the point is, if the people were awake enough in California, right, Californistan, they could have actually voted out the sheriff, and there are things they could have done instead of just sliding by. But anyways, powers and duties of the police force. Here's why the police must do what the governor and the General Assembly and the local law ordinance say. 15.2-1704, the police force of a locality is hereby invested with all the power and authority which formerly belonged to the office of the constable at common law, the sheriff, and is responsible for the prevention and detection of crime, the apprehension of criminals, the safeguard of life and property, the preservation of peace, and the law enforcement state of in the enforcement of state, local laws, regulations, and ordinances. Notice that. Interesting, isn't it? The police officer is responsible for the enforcement of all laws. The scope is much less broad than the sheriff. The sheriff is very broad and has the authority to deputize. That's in another section just next to this one. The sheriff shall exercise the powers conferred and perform the duties imposed of the sheriffs by general law. That's huge. That is very broad. It means the sheriff can do almost anything in a law enforcement capacity. Here, the police usurp the power of the sheriff and must follow and must enforce the laws of the state and any regulations and ordinances thereof. Guys, if that doesn't kind of share with you the difference between the two and why some sheriffs can stand up and say, you're not doing this in my county, and kick out other law enforcement, right? Then I don't know what does. It's a pretty exciting thing. We've talked about a lot today, and we're going to go ahead and pick that up for now. This is going to be the end of the show. There are a couple of questions left. We didn't even talk about exactly how this was happening. We didn't talk about how these things would go over. We talked a little bit about the referendum, but today I really just wanted to share with you the difference between the police and the sheriff and how the power of the sheriff can affect what's going on. And if I didn't make it absolutely clear, let me put this little bow on it. Norfolk could make whatever statement it wanted to about what laws it would or would not impose when it comes to the Second Amendment. If there was no police department in Norfolk, but the police were replaced with the constitutionally provided sheriff and deputies, the sheriff could say, I'm not having this mess. It's ridiculous. It's against the Constitution, because the sheriff's opinion matters. The sheriff could tell his deputies, we're not enforcing that law. It's unconstitutional. And his deputies would not enforce it. But with the police force, that's no such thing. They have to, by mandate of how they have their power and authority. Guys, I'm Rob with VA2A News. I hope you've enjoyed this today, and I will catch you all on the flip side.